Just curious, what device are you watching on? Phone, TV, laptop? Comment below.
The moment she said it, the entire room paused. Like God hit the mute button, and even the damn ceiling fan stopped spinning for a second out of sheer disbelief. I was halfway through a bite of store-bought potato salad, bland and overly sweet, the kind of thing you choke down at family events to be polite, when my mother's voice cut through the pastel streamers and It's a Girl banners like a serrated knife through sponge cake. "I'm just so glad," she announced, tilting her glass of cheap rosé toward the ceiling with theatrical sincerity, "that at least one of my kids turned out right." There it was, delivered like a punchline, or maybe like a punishment. The worst part? She wasn't even looking at me. Her smile was directed straight at my sister Emily, who was glowing in the middle of the room, dressed in this floral maternity dress that probably cost more than my monthly rent, cradling her baby bump like the Virgin Mary herself. The crowd, mostly extended family, old co-workers, a couple of her high school friends who still called her M, laughed politely, assuming it was some innocent joke. But my aunt caught my eye across the room, and her smile faltered just slightly. She knew, she remembered. It wasn't the first time my mother had said something like that, and it wouldn't be the last if I didn't do something about it. For 38 years, I had lived in the shadow of my younger sister's flawless trajectory. Honor roll, cheerleading, early engagement, corporate job with benefits and a retirement plan, and now, apparently, procreation. Meanwhile, my own path had been rocky, winding, and completely invisible in my mother's eyes. She still referred to my software consulting business as whatever Natalie does on her laptop. She'd once asked if I was still working on that internet stuff, like it was 1997 and I was in a chat room with strangers for fun. So I sat there, potato salad turning to paste in my mouth, and stared at the woman who had spent nearly 4 decades reminding me I was her cautionary tale, while Emily got to be the success story. And then I smiled, slow and steady, like something finally clicked into place. I wiped my fingers on a napkin, stood up from my folding chair, already wobbly from one leg being uneven, and walked over to where she stood next to the gift table, bathed in admiration and balloons. I reached into my purse, pulled out the white envelope I'd folded exactly in thirds the night before, and handed it to her like it was a goddamn wedding invitation. "That's great," I said, loud enough for the whole room to hear. "Because her boss sent this yesterday." The air changed. You could feel it, thick and buzzing, like the static before a lightning strike. The room fell silent, except for the soft mechanical whir of the baby monitor display on the table nearby. Mom blinked, confused at first, and then slid her fake nails under the flap. Her eyes scanned the first line, and her face went pale, her mouth twitching like she was trying to smile, but forgot how. No one said a word. Not Emily, not the guests, not even my cousin Shane, who usually couldn't shut up even if you gagged him. The silence was beautiful, an accidental masterpiece I'd been waiting decades to hear. I didn't need to explain what was in the envelope. I didn't need to raise my voice or make a scene. I just stepped back, leaned against the table with the cucumber sandwiches and pink deviled eggs, and took a long sip of watered-down lemonade like I was toasting to my own liberation. You might be wondering, what was in that envelope? What could possibly make a woman like my mother, sharp-tongued, never wrong, always right, go dead silent in a room she usually owned like a stage? Let's just say it wasn't a birthday card. Here's a question for you. What would you do if your own mother, at a celebration meant for someone else, stood up and publicly reminded you that you were the family's failure? Would you smile and let it slide, like I had 100 times before? Or would you finally let the truth speak for you? Because the truth, as it turns out, doesn't always need a microphone. Sometimes it's a few printed pages, neatly folded, waiting for the right moment to hit the table like a gavel. And this was my courtroom. My mother didn't finish reading it right there, not all of it. Her hand started shaking around paragraph 2. And she pressed the papers together like they might stop screaming at her if she held them tight enough. She looked at Emily, who had frozen mid-laugh with her hand still resting on her round belly. Her eyes were wide, Not the cute kind of surprised, but the kind that says something inside just cracked. I wasn't cruel, I didn't say a word, as she stared at me with that same confused betrayal I'd worn on my face since I was 12, and she forgot to pick me up from school for the third time because Emily had a dentist appointment. I just gave her that smile again, the one you give a stranger on the street who almost walked into traffic, and I walked back to my seat. But I wasn't planning to sit for long, because the thing about secrets is, once you let them breathe, they don't just sit quietly, they unravel, they crawl. They infect every corner of the picture-perfect life someone tried so hard to stage. And trust me, this baby shower, it had only just begun. People like to pretend that family wounds heal over time, that the deeper the cut, the more reason for forgiveness, as if blood somehow softens the blow rather than intensifies it. But let me tell you, some wounds don't heal. They fester in silence until one day, something as stupid and staged as a baby shower becomes the scene of a detonation you've been quietly constructing brick by brick inside your own chest for years. That envelope didn't fall out of the sky. It wasn't a spur-of-the-moment, vindictive gesture meant to humiliate anyone in front of pink balloons and sugar cookies shaped like rattles. It was the culmination of decades of being told, both loudly and in whispers, that I was the family's disappointment, the black sheep grazing in the background while the golden child basked in the glow of constant, unwavering praise. Emily was born when I was 10, which means I remember everything, every moment she cried and everyone jumped, every time she got a ribbon and it was framed, every single instance when her existence made mine invisible. I remember our mother, Linda, holding her in the hospital, beaming with the kind of joy I never saw on her face when she looked at me. The nurses said she was a miracle baby because Mom had complications the year before. And from that moment on, it was as if Emily's very presence on earth was proof of divine favor. I was smart, curious, stubborn, a little wild with my opinions and dreams, and none of that ever earned the kind of affection Emily got just for breathing. She got her first trophy at age 6 for ballet, never mind that she quit 2 weeks later because she didn't like the music. They still kept that trophy on the living room shelf until she graduated high school. Meanwhile, I won my school's science fair 2 years in a row, built a small robot in 9th grade that got me into a prestigious tech camp, and guess what my mom said? "That's cute, Natalie, but maybe you should try something a little more feminine, like Emily's cheer team uniform, which got dry cleaned every week like it was a wedding dress. When I got into Stanford, Mom said, "That's nice, but it's so far away. You sure you don't want to apply somewhere closer so you can still come home and help out with Emily?" She was 12. She didn't need help. She had the entire world bending around her like it owed her a gentle breeze every time she walked outside. Years passed. I built my life quietly, steadily, without confetti or headlines. I moved to the city, started freelancing in cybersecurity, worked for companies you've heard of and a dozen more you haven't, stayed afloat, paid my rent, paid my dues, and stayed out of the spotlight because I'd learned early on that in our family, the spotlight wasn't mine to stand in. It belonged to Emily. And Emily, she went from one well-paying job to another without ever seeming to break a sweat, floated through HR roles where she smiled, nodded, and handed out performance warnings like lollipops. She married Daniel, a perfectly inoffensive man who looked like he had been created in a lab by Pinterest moms. And the two of them bought a house with a wraparound porch and a labradoodle named Tucker. To everyone else, she was the embodiment of having it all. But I knew better, not because I wanted to, but because she made the mistake of screwing over the wrong person. And that person, unknowingly, passed the story right into my hands. It happened 3 months ago. I was helping a friend of a friend recover their hacked account. Nothing major, just some phishing attempt that escalated. In the middle of it, the client mentioned working at the same university where Emily managed HR. She laughed awkwardly and said, "You probably shouldn't repeat this, but the HR director there, Emily something, she's been under internal review. Apparently retaliated against someone she didn't like. Total mess." At first I thought, no way. Not Emily, not the queen of clean records and chirpy emails. But curiosity has a way of prying open doors even guilt tries to keep shut. And I started digging, not illegally, just connecting dots, asking gentle questions, tapping into networks I'd spent years building, and then it landed in my inbox like a dead bird on your doorstep. A PDF file from someone in admin, no subject line, just a 3-page report labeled Final Conduct Review, Emily Harrison. I read every word 3 times. She hadn't just retaliated. She'd manipulated records, altered internal memos, pressured a junior staffer to revise testimony, and effectively pushed someone out who had filed a complaint against her. The complaint? Something minor, an accusation of unprofessional behavior. But Emily had turned it into a war, and she lost. Or more accurately, she would have, if her boss hadn't decided to bury the issue and instead issue a formal warning that would stay on her record. The document was brutal, clinical, cold, and somehow perfect. I didn't print it right away. I stared at it for days, wondering what I was supposed to do with this accidental power. Do I confront her? Do I send it to her boss again, anonymously? Or do I hold it close until I find the exact moment? The perfect, poetic opening in a life full of pastel lies to reveal the truth. I didn't know back then what the answer was. But I knew the moment would come. I could feel it. And when Mom made her toast at the baby shower, raising her glass like she was baptizing Emily in praise, something inside me shifted. Not with anger, not with pain, with clarity. So I printed it, folded it, slipped it into my purse between a granola bar and an old receipt for coffee. Because some people wait for karma. Others, like me, deliver it by hand. There's something almost theatrical about silence when it falls in a room full of people who were laughing just moments before, like watching actors forget their lines mid-scene, or the orchestra dropping their instruments halfway through a symphony. And at Emily's baby shower, the quiet that followed my mother reading that envelope was not just awkward or unexpected. It was the kind of silence that carries weight, one that crushes the air out of a room and makes people suddenly interested in their phones, the frosting on their plates, anything but the woman at the center of it all who could no longer pretend the spotlight was flattering. I didn't move. I didn't flinch. I stood there watching her, not with cruelty or glee, but with the calm detachment of someone who spent a lifetime being overlooked, learning to find her power in moments where others thought she had none. Emily was trying to smile through it, her lips tight, her eyes darting between our mother and the guests as if willing them to resume their small talk and forget whatever just happened. But the performance was crumbling. And for the first time in my life, I watched my sister struggle to maintain the illusion of control. What no one else in that room knew, not the relatives who only saw us once a year at Thanksgiving, not the old high school friends who still thought of Emily as prom royalty, and certainly not my mother who refused to acknowledge any version of reality that didn't paint her youngest daughter in gold leaf, was that the envelope contained more than a warning letter. It was a reminder that every person who smiles too perfectly in public is hiding something in private. And Emily's secret just happened to be the kind that didn't stay hidden when someone like me decided it was time for the truth to come up for air. A week before the shower, I'd sat in my apartment, the document glowing on my laptop screen as I read the details again, each paragraph confirming what I had already suspected but hadn't dared to believe. Emily had weaponized her position, altering records, intimidating staff, bending the HR system, meant to protect people into a tool for petty revenge. And it wasn't just unethical, it was borderline criminal. The only reason she hadn't been fired outright was because her boss was more interested in avoiding a lawsuit than doing the right thing, so they slapped her with a formal written warning, marked it confidential, and quietly closed the case, hoping it would disappear like everything else privileged people try to bury. But paper trails have a funny way of surviving. Screenshots don't forget. And when you've been the outsider in your own family long enough, you start to develop a sixth sense for bullshit. Yours, theirs, and especially the kind that smiles in cardigans and calls itself a leader. As I stood there, drink in hand, watching my mother struggle to make sense of the paper she was clutching like a resignation letter from her fantasy life, I could feel the shift happening in real time. People were starting to murmur again. Someone turned the music down, not off, just enough to make room for whispers. My cousin Shane leaned over to my aunt and said something under his breath, and she shook her head slowly, eyes never leaving Emily, who by now had dropped the act entirely. Her face was pale, her shoulders tense, the glow she wore at the start of the day replaced by a kind of brittle panic I hadn't seen since she found out her college boyfriend cheated on her with her roommate sophomore year, and she cried so hard in the bathroom, Mom had to call an ambulance because she couldn't breathe. But this time, there was no ambulance coming, no one rushing to rescue her from the fallout. And as if on cue, the front door opened and Daniel walked in, balancing a tray of sandwiches and a diaper cake someone forgot in the car. His timing was cruel and perfect. He looked around, confused by the sudden tension, his gaze settling on Emily, then our mother, then finally me, his brows furrowing as he tried to put together a puzzle without all the pieces. Emily didn't move at first. Then she turned slowly, too slowly, like every step cost her something. She walked over to Daniel and took the tray from his hands with the stiff motion of someone doing a task, just to avoid collapsing. "Everything okay?" he asked, his voice low but clear. She nodded too fast. "Fine, just something work-related," she said, glancing sideways at me like I might explode her spot right there. And maybe I could have. Maybe I should have. But part of me wanted to see if she'd try to lie again in front of him, to keep spinning the story even as the threads came loose. Because the truth about Emily, and people like her, is they're addicted to roles. She was the good daughter, the perfect employee, the glowing mother-to-be. Her whole life was an act, a carefully curated script. And I'd just ripped out the third act and thrown it in the shredder. Now she was flailing, and every move she made was another reminder that some performances don't end with applause. They end with silence. And that silence, the kind that wraps around your neck and waits for you to make the next move, wasn't going anywhere. Not today. Not now. So I smiled again. Not cruelly, not smugly, but like someone who just opened a window in a poor house that's been choking on its own lies for too long. And I walked back to the punch bowl, poured myself another glass, and let the truth settle in like dust on my polished furniture. This wasn't about revenge anymore. This was about balance. And for the first time in years, maybe ever, the scales were starting to tip. There's a certain kind of tension that builds between sisters who've grown up under the same roof but lived entirely different lives inside it. One adored and endlessly validated, the other tolerated and quietly corrected, always 2 steps behind in a race she never agreed to run. And that kind of tension, once it reaches its boiling point, doesn't explode with screams or flying plates like in the movies. Instead, it tightens like piano wire between words, stretches between long-held silences, and when it finally snaps, the sound is quieter than you'd expect, but the damage, it reverberates through bone. That's what it felt like when Emily cornered me in the kitchen of her meticulously decorated suburban home. Her breath shallow, her voice sharp but barely controlled. The smile from earlier long gone and replaced with the brittle desperation of someone who no longer recognized the script she was supposed to follow. "What the hell did you do?" she hissed, her back to the door, eyes darting to make sure no one was in earshot. Her tone wasn't angry. It was panicked, wounded, as if she were the victim in a crime she'd been too blind to see coming. I leaned casually against the granite countertop, taking my time sipping the last of my punch, letting the syrupy sweetness linger in my mouth as I stared at her, not with malice, but with the kind of cold clarity you only get after watching someone get away with too much for far too long. "I didn't do anything," I said, placing the empty glass on the counter with a soft clink. "I just passed along something someone else wrote. That's not a crime, is it?" Her face twisted into something unfamiliar, part rage, part disbelief, part realization that the image she'd spent years cultivating might finally be crumbling beyond repair. "You're jealous," she said, almost triumphantly, like it was her final line of defense. "You always have been. That's what this is about, right? You can't stand that I'm finally happy, that Mom's proud, that—" I cut her off with a small, tired laugh. The kind that comes not from amusement, but from exhaustion. From carrying the same damn narrative your whole life and finally being able to set it down. "Emily," I said, "you torpedoed Amanda's career because she got a promotion you didn't. That's not happiness, that's poison, and it finally caught up to you." She flinched, just slightly, and that was enough for me to know she remembered exactly what I was talking about. Amanda Lee, bright, kind, better at her job than Emily ever wanted to admit, had been offered a management position, and within weeks, she was mysteriously reassigned, then gone entirely. The office gossip never stuck, and the official reason was internal restructuring. But now, with the report in hand, the truth had claws and a name. "You don't understand what it's like," she snapped, her voice cracking beneath the weight of a truth she wasn't ready to carry. "People expect me to be perfect. You wouldn't get it because no one ever expected anything from you." And there it was, the confession wrapped in insult, the raw, unfiltered core of the resentment between us. She resented my freedom as much as I resented her pedestal. She hated that I could live outside of approval while she was suffocating under its weight. I stepped closer, not to intimidate, but to make sure she heard every word, every syllable that I wasn't going to repeat. "I used to wish I had your life," I said quietly but firmly. "I used to think if I just worked harder, smiled more, stayed out of the way, Mom would look at me the way she looks at you. But you know what I learned? Being perfect doesn't mean being good. And being good, it doesn't mean being silent." Her eyes welled up, and for a split second, I saw the little girl I used to read bedtime stories to, the one who would crawl into my bed when thunderstorms got too loud. But that girl was long gone, replaced by a woman who had learned to survive by stepping on others, and now she was shocked the ground beneath her wasn't as solid as she thought. And then, right on cue, Daniel stepped into the kitchen. He looked at us both, then at Emily's face, then at mine. "What's going on?" he asked, confused but not angry. "Not yet." Emily stiffened, wiped her eyes, and tried to smile, a feeble, flickering thing that held no warmth. "Nothing," she said too quickly. "Just a misunderstanding." But Daniel's gaze lingered on the tension in the room, on the broken edge in Emily's voice, on the cold stillness in mine. He turned to me. "What's in the envelope, Natalie?" I didn't answer right away. I looked at Emily instead, giving her one last chance to tell the truth, but she didn't move. She didn't speak. And that silence said more than anything she could have come up with. So I turned back to Daniel and said, "You should read it, all of it, and then ask her why she never mentioned any of it to you." That was all it took. His expression shifted, not to anger, but to something worse. Suspicion, doubt, the beginning of disbelief. And in that moment, Emily's world began to shrink. Not collapse all at once, no, it cracked. Just slightly, like the first fault line in a dam. But those cracks always spread. I didn't need to say anything else. I walked past them both, through the hallway crowded with gift bags and smiling baby-themed signs, out to the living room where the guests were trying their best to pretend nothing had happened. I sat back down, legs crossed, calm as a lake after a storm, because I knew something Emily hadn't figured out yet. When your entire identity is built on a lie, the truth doesn't have to scream to destroy you. It just has to whisper. There is a stillness that follows exposure, a kind of eerie calm that isn't peaceful, but hollow, like the heavy quiet in the air after a storm has shredded the trees, but before anyone dares to step outside and count the broken branches. The baby shower limped forward in awkward fragments after that kitchen confrontation, with small pockets of guests pretending to enjoy cupcakes while others whispered behind paper napkins, exchanging half-finished theories and raised eyebrows, their curiosity no longer veiled by politeness. The party that had once been orchestrated with Pinterest-perfect details and color-coded trays of hors d'oeuvres now resembled the aftermath of a stage scene where the actors had suddenly realized the script was a lie and the cameras had kept rolling. Emily didn't speak much after that. She made a few clumsy attempts to steer conversations back to baby names and stroller brands, but her voice lacked conviction, her eyes never really meeting anyone's for more than a second or two. Daniel, to his credit, didn't make a scene, but he also didn't put his arm around her or whisper reassurances into her ear like he normally did at events like these. Instead, he kept glancing at the envelope, which now sat, half open and slightly crumpled, on the dining room sideboard near the stack of unopened gifts and glittery cards. He hadn't read it yet, not fully, but I could tell by the way he avoided looking at her that he already believed it contained something irreversibly damaging. As the guests began trickling out, each departure marked by awkward hugs and empty promises to catch up soon, I remained seated in my corner of the room, sipping lukewarm coffee from a floral paper cup, watching the machine of image control that Emily and my mother had built over a lifetime slowly grinding to a halt. It wasn't a victory lap, and I didn't feel triumphant. What I felt was something deeper, something quieter, a kind of release that comes when you finally stop holding your breath after years of waiting for someone else to give you permission to exhale. Later that evening, when the last guest had gone, and the house stood in that strange post-party quiet, wrapping paper half torn, ribbons strewn across furniture, discarded paper plates balanced precariously on the arms of couches, I drove home without music, letting the silence in my car speak louder than anything I could have said. I knew what was coming next. Emily would try to do damage control, and my mother, for all her pride and denial, would probably help her spin some alternative version of the story for anyone who asked too many questions. But the document existed now, out in the world, no longer buried under corporate confidentiality or family delusion. It had a life of its own, and people would talk. Around 9:30, my doorbell rang. I didn't check the peephole. I didn't hesitate. I opened the door, and there she was, my mother, Linda, standing on my porch in a trench coat she probably hadn't worn in years, her hair messier than I'd ever seen it, and her expression a mixture of fury, confusion, and something close to grief. She didn't wait to be invited in. She stepped past me and into the hallway like she owned it, like it was still 1998, and she could walk into my bedroom and start rearranging things without asking. "You ruined everything," she said, her voice low but hard, like a matchstick ready to spark. I didn't respond right away. I simply closed the door behind her and leaned against it, letting her words hang in the air like smoke. "No," I finally said, my voice steady, quiet, unshaken. "You chose everything. You chose her. Every damn time. All I did was stop pretending it didn't matter." She turned to face me fully then, her hands balled into fists at her sides, but she wasn't shouting anymore. She was staring at me like she didn't recognize me, like the daughter she had spent a lifetime molding into a cautionary tale had suddenly stepped off the page and become something else entirely. "You're bitter," she said. "You've always been bitter." That stung more than I wanted to admit. Not because it was true, but because it was lazy. Because it was the kind of dismissal that lets people like her sleep at night without reckoning with what they've done. I walked past her, into the kitchen, poured myself a glass of water, and said, "I'm not bitter, Mom. I'm done." That silenced her, not because it was loud, but because it was final. She didn't stay long after that. She looked around my small apartment one last time, eyes scanning the walls like she was seeing them for the first time, and then she left without another word, the door closing behind her with the soft, painful certainty of something ending. That night, I sat on my couch, legs tucked under me, a glass of wine in one hand, and my laptop open on the coffee table. I reread the message from the HR department, short, formal, non-committal. "Further actions pending. Thank you for your cooperation." They weren't thanking me for anything, really. They were covering themselves, keeping their distance from the mess they helped create by staying silent. But it didn't matter. What mattered was that it was out there now. I didn't feel like a hero. I didn't feel like a villain either. I felt like someone who had simply stopped playing a game she never agreed to and finally put the ball down. A week later, I heard through a mutual acquaintance, one of those Facebook friends you never really talk to, but who always seems to know everything, that Emily had been asked to take an indefinite leave of absence from work. Daniel had moved into the guest room. The shower photos never made it to social media. And me? I kept going, quietly, steadily, like always. Maybe what I did wasn't fair. Maybe it wasn't noble, but it was true. And sometimes truth is the only justice you get, whether or not it's enough. That's a question I still haven't answered. Maybe I never will.